The storm did not roar. It erased everything, turning the world into a wall of white and silence. On a frozen road, a pregnant dog took her last step, then collapsed, her breath fading into the snow. Miles away from safety, no one should have seen her. But one man did. A 55-year-old Navy SEAL stopped his truck, staring into the storm, knowing this choice would change his life. He wasn't just saving a dog. He was about to uncover a truth someone tried to bury. Because this dog wasn't lost. She was running from something far more dangerous than the cold. Where are you watching from? Let me know below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Snow had erased Pine Hollow by noon. Not buried it, not covered it, erased it. The little northern town had not disappeared all at once, but slowly, patiently, as if winter had taken a white cloth and rubbed the world until fences, porches, mailboxes, and roads all blurred into one pale silence. The temperature had fallen below 10 degrees, and the wind had sharpened into something mean, something that did not simply touch skin, but searched for a weakness in it. Doors stayed shut. Curtains glowed orange with firelight. The few trucks left outside wore white hoods and frozen windows like closed eyes. From the ridge above town, Gideon Vale's cabin looked like the last warm thought in a cold country. It was a small wooden place built near the edge of the pines, old but cared for, with a steep roof, a stout chimney, and a porch that faced the valley. Gideon had repaired most of it with his own hands. The shutters were straight. The steps were swept. Firewood was stacked in careful rows under a tarp, each log placed as though order itself could keep winter honest. Gideon Vale was 55 years old, 6'1", broad-shouldered, and built like a man who no longer trained for war but still refused to surrender to softness. His body carried the strength of long discipline rather than vanity. His face was sharply cut, clean-shaven, handsome in that stern American way that seemed carved more than born. His jaw was square and strong, his nose straight, his cheekbones firm beneath weather-marked skin. His hair, once dark, had silvered at the temples and was kept in a neat undercut that never seemed to fall out of place. He wore what he always wore, a fitted long-sleeve camouflage top and matching green camo pants, the clothes close to the body, practical and exact, with dark winter boots planted cleanly in the snow. But it was his eyes people remembered most. They were deep-set and gray-blue, quiet eyes, the kind that did not glance over the world, but measured it. There was steadiness in them, and sorrow too. Not the loud kind, not the kind that asks to be pitied. The kind that settles into a man's bones and teaches him to speak less carefully, and care more silently. Pine Hollow knew him as the man who showed up. He was the one who shoveled Mrs. Alder's front steps before dawn if the snow got too high. The one who brought canned soup and batteries to old Mr. Harlan when the roads iced over. The one who pulled sedans out of ditches, checked on generators, patched broken fences, and split wood for widows who pretended they could still do it themselves. He did these things without speeches, without jokes half the time, without lingering for thanks. He worked like weather in reverse, quietly mending what the season tried to break. That morning he had already been into town once. He had checked on June Alder, the bakery owner, a woman in her 60s with silver curls pinned back, flour always on her sleeves, and a face round with kindness and fatigue. June was short, sturdy, and endlessly maternal in the way of women who had fed half a town and scolded the other half. Gideon had fixed the latch on her storm door while she complained that he never took enough pie home with him. He had then dropped medicine at the Kerrigan's place on the lower road, where a coughing boy with red cheeks waved at him from behind a frosted window. Now, in the worst of the afternoon storm, he should have stayed inside. Instead, he drove. His truck was old, red once, rust-dark now in places, with a heater that worked only because Gideon refused to let machines die before their time. The windshield wipers fought uselessly against the snow. The road out by the edge of town had narrowed into a pale corridor between pines and old storage sheds. He kept both hands on the wheel and drove with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that pride was often just recklessness dressed for company. He hadn't always lived like this. There had been years when he moved through the world with commands in his ear and a rifle in his hands, when his life had been measured in maps, angles, and seconds. Gideon had been a Navy SEAL then, calm under fire, efficient, feared by the right people, trusted by the people who had earned it. He had survived deserts, coastlines, blacked-out compounds, and the kind of nights that never fully leave the nervous system. But none of those nights had followed him home the way one hospital room had. He did not think of it often in full. His mind refused the whole shape of that memory and fed it to him in fragments instead: the green flicker of a monitor, the antiseptic smell, a white blanket, a hand cooling in his grasp, the helplessness of arriving too late to a battle no training could fight. There had been a woman. There had been a child not yet born. There had been a future that thinned and vanished before he could hold it still. Since then, helping people had become less a virtue than a discipline. A form of penance, perhaps. Or prayer. The wind hit the truck broadside as he passed the abandoned grain shed near the edge of the old mill road. Gideon slowed instinctively. Something about that place always caught drift strangely. Snow piled there in shoulder-high ridges against rotting walls and rusted hinges. Then he saw them, not clearly at first, just marks in the snow, tracks. They were not boot prints, not deer, not fox. Too large for that. Dog tracks, but broken and uneven, appearing, vanishing, appearing again as if whatever made them had staggered more than walked. Gideon frowned and rolled forward another 10 feet before easing the truck to a stop. The engine idled low. The storm moaned around the cab. He sat still for a second. There was an old instinct in him that had never retired. It rose now, not as fear, but as a tension, a tightening behind the ribs, a sensation that something had shifted in the field of the day and would not return to normal if he drove past it. He opened the truck door and stepped down into the snow. The wind slapped him hard across the face. Cold rushed under his collar. He shut the door with one gloved hand and stood listening. There. A sound so faint he almost mistook it for the hinge squeal of the grain shed. A breath, then another. He followed the tracks around the side of the structure, boots sinking deep, snow needling his face. The shed leaned like an old drunk, one side half collapsed, the roof line sagging under ice. A strip of corrugated metal banged somewhere overhead. And beneath the broken overhang, half hidden in shadow and drift, lay the dog. She was a German shepherd, female, black and tan beneath the frost, large-framed but terribly drawn down. Even under the crust of ice in her coat, Gideon could see the ribs showing faintly at her sides. Her belly was swollen with late pregnancy, low and heavy, the life inside her close enough to the world to make the sight of her there almost unbearable. Her fur had frozen into rough clumps along her shoulders and haunches. One ear stood half-proud and torn near the tip. Around her neck, pressed deep into the fur, was the unmistakable mark of a collar worn too long or too tight. She lifted her head when he approached. Her eyes were brown shot through with amber, not dull, not animal simple, but startlingly aware. Pain lived in them, exhaustion too, and beneath both, some last hard ember of refusal. She did not bark. She did not try to rise. She only looked at him. The wind screamed across the open lot, and for one impossible second, Gideon felt as though the world had narrowed to two living things caught in it. One standing, one fallen, both far too familiar with endurance. He crouched slowly, careful not to crowd her. "It's all right," he said, though his voice sounded small against the storm. The dog's chest fluttered. A ragged breath. Then another. Her nose twitched faintly, reading him. There was mud and snow crusted on her paws, and the nails were worn down hard, as if she had traveled farther than any animal in that condition should have managed. Scratches marked her muzzle. A thin line of old blood darkened one patch of fur near her shoulder. Then came the moment that stayed with him. The dog turned her head, not toward escape, not toward the road, but toward her own swollen belly. She gave the faintest shiver, then looked back at Gideon. It was not human. He knew that. It was not language. But it felt like meaning all the same. Not me first. Them. A strange chill moved through him then, deeper than the weather. Not fear. Recognition. As Gideon shrugged off the wool blanket he kept in the truck and stepped closer, the dog did something that made him freeze. With what little strength she had left, she dragged one paw through the snow and touched the hem of his boot, then let her head fall again. It was not a defensive move, not a collapse either. It felt, absurdly and unmistakably, like a choice. Something inside Gideon shifted. The old hospital memory flashed again, not as image this time, but as accusation. Too late. Too late. Too late. His jaw tightened. "Not this time," he muttered, and the wind took the words. He wrapped the blanket around the dog as gently as he could. Up close, the truth was worse. She smelled of cold metal, wet fur, old hunger. Her body was warmer than the air, but too warm in the wrong way, fever hidden under freezing. She flinched when his hand brushed near her neck, then stilled, trembling violently. Beneath the blanket he could feel how light she was for her size. Not a stray, he thought. Abandoned, escaped, thrown away? No. There was intention in the damage. He slid one arm under her chest and another beneath the weight of her belly, careful, testing her response. She gave a low sound, not a growl exactly, more a strained warning born of instinct, but she did not snap. She watched him the whole time, eyes heavy but open, measuring whether he would hurt what she carried. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." The effort of lifting her told him how close she was to done. She was not just tired. She was running on whatever final reserve animals keep hidden for their young. He turned carefully, boots slipping once in the drift, and carried her back toward the truck. By the time he got her into the back seat, his breathing had roughened, and snow had worked its way down the back of his neck. He spread the blanket under her, then tucked another old coat around her sides. She struggled once, trying to curl her body around her belly, and he saw the instinct in it immediately. Even here, even now, she was shielding the unborn from cold, impact, and the world itself. Gideon shut the rear door, circled back to the driver's side, and climbed in. For a moment, he did not start moving. He just sat there with both hands on the wheel, listening to the engine hum, and the storm beat its fists against the truck. In the mirror, he could see her. Her head lay low. Frost was melting slowly from the fur around her muzzle. Her breathing was shallow and fast, but she was still conscious, still watching. He had seen men in worse condition survive on less. He had also seen hope disappear, while everyone in the room still pretended otherwise. He would not pretend. He turned the heater higher and took out his phone with one hand. The signal was weak, wavering, but enough. He called Dr. Eliza Boone's clinic and got the answering line, then her cell. No answer yet. He left a short message, crisp, urgent, exact. Pregnant shepherd, severe exposure, possible pneumonia. I'm bringing her in unless the roads close first. He tossed the phone back onto the seat and put the truck in gear. The road to his cabin climbed through the pines, narrower, steeper, lonelier. Snow surged through the headlights in sheets. Once the rear tires slid, and he corrected without panic. Every few seconds his eyes went to the mirror. The dog had not closed hers. "Need a name for you," he said at last, surprising himself. She did not react unless the slight lift of one ear counted. He thought of all the bright things winter tried to erase. The stars, the road lines, the roofs. He thought of the old stories June Alder liked to tell in the bakery about sailors following distant lights home. "Astra," he said. The name settled strangely fast in the cab. Behind him, the dog breathed in, then out, fogging the cold glass. For the first time since he found her, her eyes softened, not with trust, not yet, but with the tired surrender of something that had finally run out of places to flee. Gideon tightened his hands on the wheel. The cabin light would be visible soon through the trees. Fire, warmth, towels, water. A doctor if God allowed roads and timing to meet in mercy. But he knew already this was no simple rescue. No animal in that condition traveled so far by accident. No collar mark cut that deep without history. No eyes looked like that unless they had seen cruelty and kept moving anyway. As the truck climbed into the storm and the pines leaned close around the road, Gideon felt the shape of the day changing beneath his hands. He had brought home many broken things in his life, tools, engines, pieces of himself. This time, he thought, glancing once more into the mirror, he had brought home a living tragedy. And somewhere inside that trembling black and gold body, beneath the blanket, beneath the fever, beneath the last stubborn beat of survival, another story was waiting to be found. By the time Gideon reached the cabin, the storm had grown teeth. The truck climbed the last bend of the ridge road with a low mechanical groan, tires grinding through packed snow, headlights cutting brief yellow wounds into the white dark. Pine Hollow had vanished below him. The town lights that usually looked warm and stubborn from a distance were gone behind the weather now, swallowed whole. Only the cabin lamp in his front window remained, a single dim square waiting above the drifted steps. Gideon killed the engine and sat for one short second in the sudden silence. Not true silence. The wind still prowled around the truck, pushing against the doors, combing through the pines with a sound like dry bones dragged across glass. But inside the cab there was a pause, and in that pause he listened for the dog behind him. Astra was still breathing, fast, shallow, wet. He opened the rear door, and the cold rushed in hard enough to sting his teeth. The German shepherd lay curled around her burdened belly as tightly as the cramped space allowed. Meltwater had begun to darken the blanket around her. Her coat, black along the spine and warm tan beneath, had lost some of its frozen stiffness in the heater, but only enough to reveal how poor her condition truly was. She was large-framed, maybe 5 years old, with the noble architecture of a working shepherd still visible beneath deprivation. One torn ear tipped sideways. The old collar mark at her neck showed pale and angry where the fur had been rubbed down too long. Her eyes found Gideon the instant he leaned in, awake, guarded, exhausted beyond measure. "It's home for tonight," he said softly. He slid his arms beneath her again. This time the weight surprised him less than the heat. Fever radiated off her through the wet fur, wrong and urgent. As he lifted, she made a strained sound deep in her throat, not protest exactly, but a warning sent by instinct to any world that might threaten what she carried. Gideon adjusted without hesitation, one arm stronger beneath her chest, the other firm and careful under her hindquarters, so no pressure came against the swollen belly. Snow knifed into the back of his neck as he carried her up the steps. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, iron stove heat, and old coffee. It was one room wide in spirit, even if a narrow hall led to a washroom and sleeping alcove. A table stood near the front window. Shelves lined one wall with books, jars, tools, and precisely folded cloth. The stove glowed in the far corner, its orange heart pulsing behind black iron ribs. Nothing in the room was expensive. Everything in it had been repaired, cleaned, sharpened, stacked, or mended by a patient hand. Gideon set Astra down on a thick wool blanket near the stove, but not too close. Even in a hurry, he remembered restraint. A body that had been frozen could not simply be thrown against heat and ordered back into comfort. He knelt beside her, removed the wet outer blanket, and began rubbing her gently with dry towels pulled from a shelf beside the sink. Steam faintly rose from the snow packed along her sides. She coughed. It was a raw, tearing sound, deeper than her throat. Her chest fluttered after it, as if her lungs had forgotten for a moment how to continue. Gideon's jaw set. "Yeah," he murmured. "I heard it in the truck." He worked steadily, not quickly. Years in the service had taught him that panic made clumsy hands, and clumsy hands ruined fragile things. He dried one leg, then the next, pausing whenever Astra's breathing changed or her eyes widened with too much fear. At times she trembled violently. At times she went so still that he had to lean close to hear the damp whisper of air through her nose. Her paws were cracked. 2 nails were worn jagged. Along the side of her muzzle, beneath the thawing fur, were fine healed scratches, as if she had once tried to force her way through wire or splintered wood. When he laid a hand near her ribs, he could count too much of her. Not starving to the skeleton, no, but long underfed. The kind of body that had been kept alive without ever being cared for. He stood, crossed to the stove, and added 2 logs. Flames answered with a low settling crack. Then he moved to the wall phone charger, saw his cell had finally pulled signal, and dialed Dr. Eliza Boone again. She answered on the 3rd ring, Her voice came clipped and alert, already half in motion. "Boone, it's Gideon Vale. Tell me." He did. Exposure. Late pregnancy. Fever. Productive cough. Weak but responsive. She asked no foolish questions, no soothing ones either, only the useful ones. How long had the dog been indoors? Was she drinking? Any bleeding? Labor signs? Could she stand? Did he have saline? Hot water bottles? Clean towels? Dr. Eliza Boone was 43, broad-shouldered for a woman, not tall but solidly made, with chestnut hair usually pulled into a low knot, and a face sharpened by both intelligence and weather. Her skin had the pale gold cast of someone who spent long winters driving back roads and longer summers bent over anxious animals. She wore her competence plainly, no wasted motion, no ornamental softness. But there was kindness in her, the unsentimental kind that did not collapse under pressure. "I can't get him to the clinic," Gideon said. "You're not taking her anywhere in this," Eliza replied. "I'll come up." "You sure?" "I'm already putting chains on the truck." The line clicked dead. Gideon looked at Astra. "You picked a dramatic night," he said. Her ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. He brought a bowl of lukewarm water and set it near her muzzle. For a few seconds she only stared at it, eyes dull with fatigue. Then, slowly, she lowered her head and drank. Not greedily, carefully. A few laps, then a pause, then more, as if she no longer trusted abundance not to vanish or punish. He watched that with something tightening inside him. The storm battered the windows. The stove breathed. Somewhere in the wall, old wood settled with a soft complaint. Gideon took a folded quilt from the chair by the table and made a second nest around the first, building warmth in layers. When he returned, Astra had shifted slightly. Not toward the bowl, toward the darkest corner of the cabin, where the shadows met beneath a side table. Her gaze stayed fixed there for several seconds, and Gideon followed it automatically. Nothing. Just floorboards, a braided rug, the leg of the table. Still, the intensity of that look lingered in the room like a question. Astra made a low, strained sound and pushed one paw weakly toward that same shadowed corner again, then stopped, her strength spent. It was such a deliberate movement that Gideon rose and crossed to the spot, crouching to inspect the floor. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then, when the fire shifted, a line of light slipped across the boards and caught on a shallow scrape near the baseboard. 3 parallel marks, old, almost hidden, as if something metal had once been dragged there. He touched the wood with 2 fingers and frowned. The marks meant nothing by themselves. And yet the dog, feverish and half-broken, had looked straight at them. When he turned back, Astra had closed her eyes, but her breathing had changed again. Faster now, as though even that small act had cost her. The moment passed. The mystery remained. And the room, warm as it was, no longer felt entirely simple. By the time Eliza arrived, the snow had climbed halfway up the porch railing. Gideon heard the grind of chains before he saw the truck lights. Then came a firm knock and a burst of cold as he opened the door to let her in. She brought winter with her, white flecks in her hair, red along the cheekbones, a canvas medical bag in one hand, and a portable kit in the other. She wore a cream veterinary coat under a dark parka, gray turtleneck at the throat, dark work pants tucked into snow boots. Practical clothes, hard used, honest. "You look terrible," she told Gideon. "Nice to see you, too." "That wasn't for you." She crossed the room and knelt beside Astra in one fluid movement, already shedding gloves. The dog opened her eyes at once, head lifting an inch, then falling back. Eliza did not touch her immediately. She looked first. That was one of the reasons Gideon trusted her. She believed observation was a form of respect. Her gray-green eyes moved over the body with swift precision. Abdomen, chest movement, mucous membranes, paw damage, coat condition, the old neck ring, the ear tear. "Hey, girl," she said quietly to Astra. "You've had a bad road." Astra gave no answer except a tremor under the skin. Eliza glanced up. "Hold the lantern closer." Gideon did. The next minutes filled with useful motions. Thermometer, stethoscope, gentle pressure at the gums, fingers beneath the jaw, palm against the swollen abdomen. Astra tolerated it with the stoicism of an animal too depleted to waste energy on drama. But when Eliza's hand came near her lower side, she stiffened and her pupils widened with old fear. Eliza paused immediately. "All right, I see you." She listened to the lungs for a long time, too long for Gideon's liking. Then she sat back on her heels. Fever. Chest sounds are rough. Likely pneumonia starting, maybe already established. She's dehydrated, underweight, and too close to term for comfort. Eliza peeled off one glove with her teeth. "I can stabilize, but I can't solve." "How close?" "Could be a week, could be less. Stress changes things." Gideon nodded once. "Tell me what to do." Before Eliza could answer, there came another knock, quicker, lighter, somehow indignant even through the storm. Gideon opened the door, and Martha Quinn pushed in carrying a metal thermos and a grocery sack. Martha was 70 if she was a day, small and wiry, with silver hair twisted into a bun that looked as if it had once been neat, and then refused to apologize for weather. Her eyes were bright black-brown behind round glasses, watchful eyes that missed very little and forgave even less. She had the dry mouth of a woman who had spent 40 years asking difficult questions into microphones and across kitchen tables. Once, long ago, she had been a regional reporter. Now she lived alone down the slope, in a blue house with too many books and a bird feeder. No bird could approach without first being judged. "I brought soup," she said, lifting the thermos, "because men in crises forget food and start making noble mistakes." Her gaze dropped to Astra. The humor vanished. "Well," Martha said softly, "there you are." She set the groceries down and crouched, knees cracking audibly. Unlike many people, she did not reach for the dog right away. She simply looked, her sharp old face gentled. "That collar mark," she murmured. Eliza nodded grimly. "I saw it." Martha's eyes slid to the windows as some distant engine groaned somewhere below on the ridge road, muffled by snow. Astra reacted instantly, a full-body flinch, head lifting, ears trying to flatten and rise at once. Martha saw that too. "That," she said, voice losing all softness, "is not a dog that wandered off from kindness." The cabin went still around the words. Gideon felt them settle deep. Eliza began preparing a line for fluids, talking him through each step. What to watch for, how often to offer water, how to keep the heat steady and not too high, how to monitor contractions if they began too soon, if bleeding started, if the coughing worsened, if the breathing dropped instead of raced, they would have to attempt the county hospital as soon as the road opened a little. Martha poured Gideon soup he did not remember accepting. He drank it standing up. Hours later, after Eliza left with promises to return at first light, if the storm allowed, and after Martha finally bundled herself back into the night, Gideon sat on the floor near the stove with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up. Astra slept in fragments. Not rest, exactly. More a negotiation with pain. Once, sometime after midnight, she whined in her sleep. Not loud, just one thin sound. Then her legs jerked, as if running. Her lip twitched. Her breathing broke into panicked little bursts. Gideon leaned forward, not touching her, waiting. The sound came again, smaller, and then she startled awake so violently she tried to rise and nearly collapsed. "Easy," he said at once, low and steady. She stared at him wild-eyed for one terrible second, not seeing him, seeing someone else, someone from before. Then awareness returned. Her chest heaved. She did not growl. She only looked ashamed of the fear, if an animal can look ashamed. Something cold and merciless opened in Gideon then. He had known violence, carried it, directed it, survived it, but there was a difference between force used in war and cruelty practiced on the helpless. One was hell with rules. The other was rot. He sat there a long time after that, watching the fire burn lower. Near dawn, when the snow outside finally softened from rage to whisper, he rose to check the bedding beneath her. The towel under Astra's body had shifted. As he straightened it, The lantern light caught on the skin beneath the thinner fur of her lower belly. He stopped. There, running in faint parallel lines along the underside of her body, were old abrasions, not random scars. Repeating, too even, too familiar in their pattern once seen. Wire flooring, crate bars, short confinement, something metal beneath her for a long, long time. Gideon went very still. The stove ticked. Wind moved gently along the eaves. Astra watched him through half-closed eyes, too tired now to hide anything. He did not speak, but when he looked at those marks, then at the old ring around her neck, then at the dog herself, curled stubbornly around the lives inside her, he understood with a certainty that settled like iron in the chest. Astra had not merely been lost. She had escaped. And somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the ridge, beyond whatever lie the world had told itself about her, there was a hand that had done this. Gideon Vale sat back on his heels in the first gray light of morning, and for the first time in many years, anger came to him not hot, not wild, but cold and perfect, the kind that waits. For 3 days after the storm, the cabin learned a new rhythm. It learned the soft scrape of Gideon's boots crossing the floor at midnight, the quiet clink of a spoon against a bowl, the low murmur of a man who had lived too long in silence and was only now beginning to speak aloud again, not because he expected answers, but because the room no longer felt empty enough to swallow every word. It learned the fragile sound of Astra drinking, in careful intervals, the wet heaviness of her cough, and the way she shifted in sleep as if pain moved through her, even when rest tried to claim her. Outside, Pine Hollow glittered beneath a bright northern cold, the world scrubbed clean after violence. The storm had passed, but winter had not loosened its hand. The roads remained half-buried. Roofs flashed white in the pale sunlight. Smoke rose from chimneys like small prayers. People came out carefully now, shoveling steps, checking pipes, tapping frozen tires with mittened hands. Inside the cabin, warmth held, hard-won, watched, deliberate. Gideon Vale kept Astra near the stove, but never too near. He changed her blankets twice a day. He warmed water bottles and wrapped them in cloth. He offered broth, softened food, and medicine exactly on schedule, his movements precise with the old muscle memory of a man trained to preserve life under pressure. At 55, he still carried himself with the straight-backed restraint of a SEAL, broad through the shoulders, lean and disciplined, his fitted green camouflage shirt and matching pants sitting close to his body like the uniform of a life he had never fully left behind. But there was something different about him now. He no longer moved through the cabin as if it were merely shelter. He moved like a man standing watch over something sacred and temporary. Astra improved just enough to be dangerous to Hope. Her breathing eased a little. The fever came down, then hovered. She began eating more than a few mouthfuls at a time. Her eyes, amber-brown and deep, regained a trace of their old clarity. Some of the panic left her face, not all of it, never all. She still startled at engine sounds from the road below. She still watched doors and windows as though memory could enter through glass. But she was no longer drifting at the edge of collapse every minute of the day. That alone felt like a miracle Gideon did not trust himself to name. Dr. Eliza Boone came each afternoon, sometimes at dusk, depending on the roads. She would arrive in her heavy truck, wearing the same practical winter coat over her cream veterinary jacket, chestnut hair pulled low, gray-green eyes sharpened by fatigue and purpose. Eliza did not waste movement or speech. She checked Astra's lungs, temperature, hydration, gum color, the tension in her abdomen. She listened to the pups' heartbeats through their mother's body and frowned more often than she smiled. "She's holding," she said on the third day, standing near the table while Gideon rinsed bowls at the sink. "That's not the same as healing." "No," Eliza answered. "It isn't." He dried his hand slowly. "How long?" She looked at Astra, who lay curled on her side, chin on the blanket, belly low and heavy, ears turning toward their voices. "Could still be several days," Eliza said. "Could be tomorrow if her body gives up trying to wait." Gideon looked over, too. "You mean, if it decides it can't hold them any longer?" Eliza met his eyes. "That's exactly what I mean. He nodded once. He appreciated that she did not dress Truth in softer clothes than it wore naturally. Martha Quinn came and went as well, not daily, but often enough to make the cabin feel touched by community, without ever becoming crowded. She would bring canned goods, bread, gossip stripped of malice, and the kind of sharp observations only a woman who had once made a career out of asking dangerous questions would notice. Martha was in her 70s, slight and silver-haired, her clever dark eyes magnified behind round lenses, her olive sweater always carrying a trace of wood smoke. She pretended she came to deliver supplies. Gideon knew she came because she had already decided that whatever story had attached itself to this dog had not finished unfolding. On the fourth evening, a new cold front moved down from Canada. Gideon felt it before the weather radio said the words. The air outside the cabin changed character. It thinned. It sharpened. The pines stopped sighing and began whispering again in that tight, dry way that meant real bitter cold was coming. By sunset, the windows had edged with white. Astra would not settle. She rose, circled, lay down, stood again. Her cough had quieted that day, but something new had taken hold of her body. Her flanks tightened and released in uneven waves. Her ears stayed pinned half back. Twice she pawed at the blankets. Once she stopped eating in the middle of a bowl and simply stood there, staring at nothing, chest moving too fast. Eliza arrived an hour later and took one look before kneeling. "All right," she said softly. "It's tonight." Gideon's face did not change, but inside him something dropped like a stone through deep water. The labor began slowly, badly. Astra strained, but the contractions were weak and poorly timed. She trembled through them, teeth showing not in aggression but effort. Sweat dampened the fur around her muzzle. Eliza stayed beside her, sleeves rolled, hands steady, voice low. Gideon moved wherever she told him to move. More towels, more hot water, fresh lamp oil, scissors, blankets, the phone, the flashlight, the truck keys left where they could be grabbed in 1 second, and no more. The first puppy came near midnight. It was so small that for a moment Gideon thought his eyes had lied to him. A dark, slick shape, no bigger than both his palms together, limp, silent, frighteningly still. Astra turned at once despite her exhaustion, licking with frantic devotion, but her movements had begun to lose strength. Eliza intervened, clearing the tiny airway, rubbing the pup with a clean towel. "Come on," she murmured. "Come on, little thing." Gideon knelt on the other side of the blankets and held the lamp lower. He had seen men die faster than that puppy seemed to breathe. He hated how familiar the waiting felt. Then the tiny chest fluttered. Once, again. A sound came out of the newborn so small it was barely a squeak, but it pierced the room like the first match struck in darkness. Astra made a broken noise and reached for the pup with her nose. The second came too fast after the first. Too fast for a body this weak. Smaller still, pale around the muzzle, legs twitching faintly. The third took longer and nearly took Astra with it. By the time it emerged, she was panting so hard her whole ribcage shook. Blood darkened the blankets more than Eliza liked. The third pup did not cry at all. Eliza's head snapped up. "We're going." Gideon did not waste breath asking if she was sure. "She's crashing," Eliza said, already wrapping the weakest puppy in warmed cloth. "Pups are too small, too cold, too compromised. One may not hold oxygen. She may hemorrhage or stop producing enough force. We need the county hospital now." The county veterinary hospital sat 40 miles away on clear roads. That night, the roads were not clear, but Gideon was already moving. As he lifted Astra toward the truck a second time in less than a week, one of the newborn puppies, tiny, damp, barely alive, opened its mouth and let out a thin, stubborn cry into the freezing dark. The sound stopped everyone for half a heartbeat, not because it was loud, because it was defiant. Astra, half-conscious, answered with the faintest turn of her head toward that voice. In that instant, Gideon felt something that had nothing to do with training, medicine, or winter. It felt like a command without words, not to panic, not to surrender, not while even the smallest life in the room was still insisting on being here. The truck ride felt less like travel then evacuation. Eliza sat in the back with Astra and the puppies, one gloved hand bracing the mother, the other monitoring the weakest pup's tiny breathing against a portable warming pack. Gideon drove with both hands welded to the wheel. Snow flared through the headlights. The mountain roads rose and dropped like frozen breath. Twice he fishtailed and corrected. Once a plow loomed out of white nowhere and forced him nearly into the shoulder. He did not curse. He did not pray aloud. He only drove. The hospital rose from the dark after 1 a.m. Low brick, bright windows, blue-lit sign, a shape of order in a world temporarily ruled by weather. Inside, warmth hit them first, then fluorescent light, then movement. A veterinary technician named Lena Ortiz met them at the emergency intake doors. She was in her early 30s, slim and fast-moving, with dark braided hair pinned tight at the back of her head and tired brown eyes that somehow still held kindness at 3 a.m. Her scrub top was hidden under a navy fleece, and her hands were those of someone used to reaching into chaos without trembling. She asked questions while already taking the weakest puppy from Eliza's arms and signaling for oxygen and warming support. Another vet came in moments later, Dr. Raymond Kessler, the hospital's overnight lead, a man in his late 50s with iron-gray hair, a square face lined by long hours, and the controlled impatience of someone who had spent decades dragging fragile lives back from edges they had no right returning from. He was not warm in manner, but competence has its own form of mercy. Within minutes, Astra vanished behind swinging doors with Eliza beside her. The puppies were taken to a neonatal station. Gideon was left in the waiting corridor under hard lights, hands empty for the first time all night. Waiting was worse than movement. He sat, stood, paced once, then forced himself to stop pacing. The walls smelled faintly of antiseptic and dog shampoo and old coffee. Somewhere farther down the hall, a cat cried in rhythmic outrage. A vending machine hummed. The clock above the reception desk made each minute feel like an accusation. At last, Eliza came out, mask lowered, exhaustion visible now around her eyes. "She's alive," she said. Gideon exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. She developed complications after delivery, not catastrophic, not yet, but close enough. Infection risk is high. She's depleted, Gideon, really depleted, and the pups. Eliza shook her head. Undersized across the board, the smallest nearly arrested. They'll make it? She did not answer quickly enough for comfort. They have a chance. Then came the number. Even for emergency medicine, even in a county hospital, the cost hit like blunt force. Oxygen support, warming care, stabilization, imaging, medication, overnight monitoring for Astra, and all 3 puppies. Gideon looked at the estimate and felt the old reflex rise, the cold, efficient instinct to calculate, prioritize, strip away all non-essential things until survival could be purchased. But there was nothing non-essential left. He had savings, yes, but not enough. Not after years of modest living, repairs, winter costs, taxes, medicine, fuel. He could manage some, not all. "Take the first payment," he said. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with soft blonde hair and a face made patient by years of dealing with frightened owners, nodded apologetically. "We'll need a commitment for the rest by morning." Morning. Gideon stepped outside into the hospital parking lot where the storm had weakened into bitter drifting flakes. He stood under the security light, breath smoking around him, and took off his watch. It was military steel, black-faced, heavy, worn smooth at the edges where skin and time had polished it. Not government-issued. Personal. A gift from a teammate named Daniel Reeve on the last deployment they had survived together. Reeve had been all sharp humor and reckless bravery, the kind of man who laughed before breaches and read psalms in helicopters when he thought no one heard him. He had died 2 years later in a country Gideon no longer liked to name. The watch was the last thing Gideon owned that still felt like proof of that life. He turned it once in his palm. Then he went to the all-night pawn and precious metal shop 2 blocks down, the only light still burning on that strip, and sold it. Not for what it was worth. For what it could do. When he returned, Martha was in the waiting room. Of course she was. Her coat was buttoned wrong in her hurry, snow melting off her shoulders, reading glasses crooked on her nose. "June called me," she said before he could ask. "Eliza texted her. I made calls." She pressed a folded envelope into his hand. Inside was cash, not enough to change the world, enough to tell him he was not carrying this alone. "Bakery jar," Martha said. "Hardware store owner. 2 church ladies. Don't get sentimental." Something in Gideon's throat tightened, but he only nodded. By dawn, Astra was stable enough to nurse with assistance. Gideon stood outside the recovery glass and watched her lying on clean white bedding, still weak, still frighteningly thin beneath the black and tan coat, but alive. One by one, the 3 tiny puppies were brought near. They looked less like dogs than sparks with fur, small, fragile, unfinished. Yet when they were placed against her, Astra lifted her head with visible effort and touched each one with her nose, counting them in the only language that mattered. The weakest latched first with help. The second followed. The third took longer, but then found its place too. Gideon sat in the hall afterward, shoulders bowed, his rough hands wrapped around Astra's old worn collar that the staff had removed for treatment. The leather was cracked, the metal buckle was rust-stained. It looked like the kind of thing that should have been thrown away years ago. Instead, it lay in his palm, like evidence. Beyond the glass, under hospital lights that flattened everything except truth, Astra lay between her 3 newborns like a mother pulled back from the storm by nothing more glamorous than stubborn love, borrowed money, and the refusal of a tired man to let one more life slip past him unanswered. A week later, the cabin no longer sounded like solitude. It sounded like life learning to breathe in small, uncertain pieces. The old wooden room that had once held only the crackle of the stove, the scrape of Gideon Vale's boots, and the quiet discipline of one man's habits now carried softer noises. Tiny rooting sounds, weak squeaks, the rustle of blankets, the careful shift of Astra's body when she adjusted herself around the 3 fragile puppies pressed against her belly. The place had not grown louder in any grand way. It had simply changed its heartbeat. Morning light lay pale across the floorboards. Outside, the snow still covered the valley in white, but the sky had cleared to a hard, brilliant blue that made every shadow look sharp enough to cut. Pine Hollow seemed gentle from a distance again, the way winter country often does after it has finished trying to kill something. Chimneys sent up smoke. The road below the ridge glittered like glass. Far off, the church steeple flashed in the cold sun. Inside, warmth had become work. Gideon moved through that work with the same steady precision he had once given to missions, but there was no steel in it now, only care. He cleaned bottles, warmed cloths, measured out medicine, checked Astra's breathing, and kept the fire fed. At 55, he still wore his fitted green camouflage shirt and matching pants as naturally as other men wore flannel, his broad-shouldered frame carrying the clothes with the quiet authority of long discipline. His face remained sharply handsome in the severe, clean-cut way it always had been. Strong jaw, silver at the temples, blue-gray eyes marked by old grief. But the hardness in him had shifted these past days. He still looked like a man who could endure almost anything. He no longer looked like a man enduring only for himself. Astra was stronger now, though not well. Her black and tan coat had regained some gloss where the hospital baths and Gideon's careful brushing had lifted the grime and cold from it. But she was still too thin, the old collar scar still visible beneath the fur at her neck, one ear still nicked, her chest still rising too fast when she exerted herself. Her eyes, amber-brown and deeply watchful, had lost none of their vigilance. If anything, they had grown sharper since the puppies arrived. Motherhood had not softened her fear. It had only given it direction. The pups themselves were still small enough to seem improbable. One had a pale star-shaped patch on its chest, another one ear that folded more stubbornly than the other, and the third a darker face, almost masked across the eyes. They were alive, which some mornings felt miraculous enough. Their bodies were warm now instead of frighteningly cool. Their cries had grown stronger, their movements less feeble. Still, every hour seemed borrowed. Every ounce mattered. Gideon was warming a feeding cloth near the stove when Astra's head lifted. not toward the pups, toward the front window. Her ears came up. The fur along her shoulders tightened. Gideon turned. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the white slope below the cabin, the fence line, the road cutting across the pines. Then, through the wavering glare of sun on snow, a truck moved slowly past the lower bend. Not driving through, not traveling with purpose. Crawling, watching. It was dark-colored, maybe gray or black beneath the salt and snow. Too far down to identify, but close enough that Gideon felt the old instinctive narrowing of focus come over him. He stood motionless, eyes fixed until the truck disappeared around the curve. Astra did not relax. She got to her feet with an effort that made Gideon's mouth flatten, stepped between the window and the nest of blankets, and stood there with her body angled protectively, one paw slightly forward, eyes alert and fixed. He looked back at her and understood immediately. This was not curiosity. This was recognition. By noon, the tire tracks were visible beyond the gate. They were fresh and deep, pressed into the snow at the edge of the cabin drive, but not turning in. Someone had come far enough up the ridge to look, then chosen not to announce himself. Gideon crouched near them in the cold, gloved fingers, brushing the packed tread. Wide tires, heavy truck, not local plow pattern. He straightened slowly and scanned the tree line out of habit, though he knew anyone watching now would be long gone. When he stepped back inside, Martha Quinn was already there. No one in Pine Hollow knocked like Martha. She let herself in with the brisk authority of a woman who believed doors were often too polite for truth. She carried a brown paper bag in one arm and wore her usual olive sweater beneath a thick winter coat, silver hair pinned back carelessly, round glasses low on her nose. Her small frame gave people the wrong impression until she opened her mouth. Martha had spent decades as a reporter in places where men lied with expensive smiles and expected not to be noticed. Age had not gentled her so much as refined her. "You look like a man who's seen footprints he doesn't like," she said. "Tire tracks," Gideon answered. Martha's eyes slid to Astra, who was still standing guard over the pups, despite the strain of it. "That dog heard something in the road before you did, I'd wager." "I believe that." Martha set the bag down on the table, fresh bread, canned milk, a jar of chicken broth, and came to the window. "Tell me everything." He did. She listened with her head tipped slightly to one side, the way she used to when interviewing people who didn't know yet that they were about to say more than they meant. When he finished, she looked once toward Astra, then back to the road. "Kind men think evil is dramatic," she said quietly. "It usually isn't. It circles. It studies. It tries the latch first." Gideon said nothing. He was still thinking about her words an hour later when the knock came. This one was soft, measured, almost courteous. Astra reacted before Gideon reached the door. She did not bark. She froze. Every muscle in her body drew tight at once, and then she backed toward the pups, lowering herself over them with a low, vibrating sound in her chest, so deep it seemed to come from somewhere older than fear. Gideon opened the door. The man standing there looked, at first glance, like exactly the sort of person a small town was trained to trust. He was in his late 40s, perhaps, tall and neatly put together in a charcoal overcoat, tailored close through the shoulders, with dark trousers, polished boots, and black leather gloves he had not bothered to remove. His face was clean-shaven, handsome in a narrow, well-maintained way, with high cheekbones, straight teeth, and dark hair combed neatly back from a pale, composed forehead. The cold had touched his skin, but not roughened it. Even his expression was arranged, pleasant, restrained, reasonable. Only his eyes failed him. They were too still, too pale, the color of winter glass over deep water. "Mr. Vale?" he asked, voice smooth and controlled. "That depends who's asking." The man smiled just enough to suggest manners without offering warmth. "Cyrus Voss?" Martha, behind Gideon now, made no sound at all. But Gideon felt her attention sharpen. Cyrus glanced past him into the cabin, and Astra's low warning deepened so abruptly that it raised the hair along Gideon's arms. "I believe," Cyrus said, "you have my dog." For one suspended second, no one moved. Then Astra did something she had not done once since coming to the cabin. She showed her teeth, not in wild panic, not in confusion, but in recognition so absolute that even Cyrus's pleasant mask flickered. It lasted less than a heartbeat, a tightening near his mouth, a shadow crossing the eyes. Gone almost at once. But Gideon saw it, and so did Martha. The moment passed, yet it left behind the unmistakable feeling that the dog and the man on the porch knew one another in the worst possible way. Cyrus continued speaking as though nothing had happened. "She ran during the storm," he said. "She's skittish in weather. Always has been. I'd been looking for her." "That's so?" Gideon asked. "Yes?" Cyrus's tone remained patient, almost sympathetic, as though indulging a misunderstanding. "I breed shepherds, high-end working lines. She's valuable, the litter especially. I'm grateful you kept her alive." Martha gave the faintest snort. Cyrus ignored her. "I'm sure there's no need to make this unpleasant." Gideon did not move from the doorway. Funny thing, when most people find something valuable, they don't leave a collar scar on it. There it was again, that slight tightening at the edges of Cyrus's mouth. Not anger, annoyance. The annoyance of a man unused to being spoken to plainly. "You don't know what you're looking at," he said. "I know fear when I see it," Gideon replied, "and that dog isn't afraid of the weather." For the first time, Cyrus let his eyes rest fully on Astra. She answered by pressing herself lower over the puppies, trembling but unyielding. He smiled then, but only with the lower half of his face. "Animals get excited. People project." Martha stepped forward into view. "And men with expensive coats lie in complete sentences." Cyrus turned to her with polite surprise. "Mrs. Quinn." "Still remember my name? That's touching." He gave a tiny nod, one practiced citizen to another. "You know my reputation." "I know you donate publicly," Martha said. "Those are not always the same thing." The cold deepened in the space between them. At last Cyrus looked back to Gideon. "I have papers," he said. "Registration, breeding records, ownership. I can return with them if necessary. Or," his gaze flicked once toward the room behind Gideon, "we can avoid inconvenience. She's worth a great deal. The puppies, too. If you've grown attached, perhaps we could come to a financial arrangement." There it was, not gratitude, not concern, a transaction. Gideon's voice dropped lower. "You should leave." Cyrus's expression remained calm, but something harder came into his eyes. "Be careful, Mr. Vale. You seem like a decent man. It would be unfortunate if this became legally messy." "It'll be messy for exactly one of us," Martha muttered. Cyrus adjusted one glove. "I'll give you a day." He turned and walked back down the porch steps without hurry, his boots leaving clean, deliberate marks in the snow. At the end of the drive, he paused beside a dark SUV and looked once back at the cabin, face composed again into civic politeness, as if he were leaving a church function rather than threatening a home. Then he drove away. The cabin stayed silent long after the engine sound disappeared. Gideon shut the door. Astra remained rigid over the pups, panting through her nose. He crossed to her slowly and knelt. "He's gone," he said. She did not believe him right away. It took several minutes before her body eased by degrees, each muscle unlocking reluctantly. Gideon sat beside the nest until she lay down again. Martha folded her arms. "Cyrus Voss," she said softly. "Now that is a name I haven't liked in years." Gideon looked up. "You know him?" "Know of him. Good hair. Better lawyers. Family money somewhere in the roots. He funds the Winter Lantern Festival some years. Sends checks to the church roof repair fund. Smiles at funerals. Owns land outside the county line." She paused. "And about 8 years ago, I heard whispers about expensive shepherds, sick litters, sealed contracts, and buyers who never complained twice." "Why not?" Martha's face hardened. "Because wealthy men don't need to shout when the world has been taught to keep explaining them." By late afternoon, Eliza had arrived and heard everything. She stood at the table in her gray turtleneck and cream clinic jacket, reading the notes Gideon had made about Cyrus's visit. "If he comes back with papers, that complicates things," she said. "Not if the papers are lies," Martha answered. Lies can still take time to unwind. Gideon leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Then we start now." It was Astra who moved first. The next morning, after a restless night, Gideon clipped a lead gently to her worn collar and took her outside for a short walk. She was not strong enough for more, but Eliza had said careful movement might help her lungs and keep stiffness from settling in. The puppies slept in a padded box by the stove, fed and warm. Astra did not take the path down toward the road. Instead, she pulled toward the tree line beyond the side fence, where an old trail ran half-buried through snow and brush. Gideon let her choose. Her nose stayed low, body tense, moving with a kind of grave insistence. They went perhaps 60 yards before she stopped beside a drift piled against a fallen cedar. Then she began to dig. Not playfully, not randomly, with fierce, urgent focus. Snow flew behind her forepaws. Gideon crouched beside her and started helping with his gloved hands. Beneath the crusted drift, something dark appeared. First a strip of filthy canvas, then a short length of rusted chain, one link broken and twisted, and finally a bent metal tag with stamping half obscured by corrosion. He wiped it clean against his sleeve. There was enough left to read. Voss Ridge Kennels. Martha stared at it a long time when he carried it back inside. Then she whispered, "Well?" That was all. But in that one word, Gideon heard confirmation, old suspicion, and the opening edge of war. Later that afternoon, Deputy Nolan Pike came up the ridge. Nolan was around 40, tall and rangy rather than broad, with a narrow, weather-cut face, a straight nose that had likely been broken once, and dark blonde hair trimmed close beneath his sheriff's cap. His winter-brown deputy's coat sat squarely on his frame, the badge bright against the wool. He had the kind of clear blue eyes that made honest people trust him and guilty people underestimate him. But there was caution in him, too. The caution of a man working in a small town where every investigation had social consequences. He listened without interrupting as Gideon laid out the tag, the chain, the canvas strip, and the story of Cyrus's visit. When Gideon finished, Nolan rubbed a thumb slowly along his jaw. "Cyrus Voss has standing in this county," he said. "He donates. He sponsors school athletics. The pastor thinks he hung the moon." "Dogs don't bare their teeth at saints," Martha replied. Nolan almost smiled. Almost. "I'm not saying I disagree. I'm saying I have to move clean." "Then move," Gideon said. Nolan met his eyes. "I will, but not loud. Not yet." After he left, the light began to fade early, turning the snow outside blue. Gideon stood alone on the porch with the metal tag in his hand. It was colder than he expected, even through his glove. Inside, through the window, he could see Astra curled around the 3 puppies, her body making a living wall between them and the world. For several minutes he simply stood there, the pines breathing around him, the sky darkening above Pine Hollow. He had thought, when he first lifted her from the storm, that he was saving a suffering animal. Now he understood that he had taken hold of something else entirely. This would not be a matter of shelter alone, nor mercy, nor even money. It would be a matter of bringing a polished evil into the open and forcing it to stand without its manners. Gideon closed his hand around the tag until the rusted edge pressed hard against his palm. Behind him, the cabin glowed warm and small against the cold. Ahead of him, the valley lay white and beautiful and dangerous in the failing light. And somewhere out there walked a man with a gentle face and a practiced smile, a man who spoke of lives as if they were inventory. Gideon looked once through the window at Astra and the pups, then back toward the darkening road. The fight coming for his door would not be about keeping a dog. It would be about facing the kind of cruelty that had learned to dress itself in civility and call that innocence. By the second week after Astra returned to the cabin, Gideon Vale understood something he had always known in other forms, but had hoped not to relearn here. Truth did not walk into the light by itself. It had to be carried, sometimes dragged, sometimes defended while it bled. The cabin still glowed warmly in the evenings, but the warmth no longer felt untouched. It felt guarded. The 3 puppies had begun to show the first thin outlines of themselves as separate creatures rather than one trembling bundle of need. The largest, the one with the pale star on its chest, rooted with determined force and pushed forward even in sleep. The floppy-eared one twitched at every sound and seemed to dream noisily, paws quivering against the blankets. The darkest-faced pup, smaller than the others but more watchful, often went still before feeding, as if studying the world through senses not yet fully awake. Astra watched all of them with a devotion so absolute it hurt to witness. She was stronger now, though still not whole. Her coat had regained some thickness. Her cough had softened to an occasional roughness instead of a tearing rattle. But her body remained too lean, and the old caution in her movements had not left. Whenever the road below carried the sound of an engine, her ears sharpened, and something shuddered behind her amber eyes. She no longer hid. She guarded. Gideon recognized that instinct. It was not fear replacing courage. It was fear being put to work. That morning he stood at the kitchen counter while Dr. Eliza Boone sorted papers into a flat manila folder. Sunlight lay cold and bright across the cabin table, catching on the neat clinical handwriting on each page. Eliza had come straight from the clinic, still wearing her cream veterinary coat over a dark gray turtleneck, chestnut hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She had the composed face of a woman who had learned long ago that steady hands mattered more than dramatic words. Her features were not delicate, but clean and capable. Strong brow, alert gray-green eyes, skin made pale by northern winters and long fluorescent hours. "These are enough to begin with," she said. Gideon looked at the folder. "What's in it?" "The truth, if the right person reads it honestly." Eliza tapped the first page. "Initial exposure trauma, severe dehydration, evidence of prolonged malnutrition, respiratory infection consistent with untreated exposure, repetitive pressure scarring around the neck, old abrasions and confinement indicators under the abdomen, extreme distress response linked to one specific male subject." "You wrote that down." "I observed it," she corrected, "and I'm willing to testify to it." Martha Quinn, standing by the stove with a mug of coffee in both hands, let out a dry little hum. "That man will come in with cleaner paper than ours." Martha was wearing an olive wool sweater beneath a navy coat, her silver hair pinned in its usual practical knot. Her age showed most in her hands, which were small and fine-boned, veined and restless, the hands of a woman who had spent decades turning notebooks, camera reels, newspaper clippings, and now old grief into use. Her mind, however, had remained young in all the dangerous ways, quick, skeptical, unwilling to be charmed. "That's why paper isn't enough," she went on. "We need people, dates, memory, patterns." Deputy Nolan Pike arrived not long after. He stepped into the cabin with snow on his shoulders and that measured caution he wore like a second uniform. Nolan was in his early 40s, tall and spare, with a face cut into long, clean lines by weather and responsibility. His hair was dark blonde under his sheriff's cap, his jaw shadowed by a few hours' beard growth that made him look more tired than careless. He carried himself like a man who had once believed good and bad could be sorted into tidy files and had since discovered that small towns taught blur for survival. He accepted the folder from Eliza and read in silence. Then he looked at Gideon. "This helps." "It won't be enough," Martha said. "No," Nolan admitted. "Not alone." The 4 of them left the puppies with June Alder for 1 hour that afternoon, while Gideon, Nolan, and Martha drove out toward Voss Ridge. June had insisted on helping. She was a warm-bodied woman, in her 60s, with soft, flour-dusted hands and silver curls always threatening to escape whatever pins held them. She owned the bakery in town and had the sturdy apron-wrapped look of someone born to feed whatever came hungry to the door. She bent over the puppy box with tears in her eyes and muttered, "Lord help me, they're the size of cinnamon rolls," before settling into the rocker by the stove like a grandmother appointed by heaven itself. The road to Voss Ridge left the main county lane and curved through a stretch of pines and scrub pasture where wealth tried to disguise itself as rural modesty. Cyrus Voss's property sat beyond a black fence line, broad and snow-lipped, with a handsome main house, clean barns, and a long, low outbuilding partly hidden behind windbreak trees. Even at a distance, the place looked curated, disciplined, respectable. Money had touched every visible surface and told it how to behave. Cyrus himself came out to meet them before they had killed the engine. He wore a dark wool coat over a charcoal sweater, gloves still on, polished boots untouched by mud. He might have been 48 or 50, still handsome in the cold, polished way of men who maintain themselves with care because image is part of their trade. His hair was black and groomed straight back from a high forehead. His mouth held a courteous half-smile. His eyes held nothing one could safely trust. "Deputy Pike," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Vale, Mrs. Quinn. Quite the party." Nolan did the talking. Formal, controlled. They had no warrant. They were making inquiries. There had been a report involving an animal recovered in distress and a possible ownership dispute. Cyrus never stopped smiling. "Of course," he said. "Anything I can do. I run a legitimate operation here. Some high-end breeding, some training contracts, everything documented." "Can we see the kennels?" Nolan asked. "You may see what's open for viewing." The answer was polite enough to force patience. He led them first through the visible parts of the property, the clean barn, the feed area, a neat office with framed awards and donation certificates on the walls. Martha's mouth tightened when she saw the church fundraising plaque with Cyrus's name engraved on brass. Gideon said almost nothing. He was watching edges, listening for what belonged and what had been arranged to look as though it did. Then came the sound. Faint, brief, from farther back than Cyrus meant to take them. A dog's howl, not a bark, not play. Loneliness stretched thin enough to cut through wood. Gideon saw Nolan hear it too. Cyrus kept walking as though he had heard nothing. When they returned to the driveway, Cyrus handed Nolan photocopies of registration papers and chip information with the confidence of a man accustomed to paper functioning as costume. "I'm sure this will clear things up," he said. Martha took one glance and murmured, "Maybe, if ink learned honesty." Cyrus's smile sharpened. "I've always admired your style, Mrs. Quinn. Shame the paper industry retired before your ego did." "Newspapers shrank," Martha said. "Predators didn't." On the ride back, Nolan said little, but the silence in him had changed. It no longer felt like doubt. It felt like counting. That evening, as shadows lengthened blue over the snow, Gideon took Astra on a careful short walk down the lower path near the county road. She moved with more strength now, her black and tan body lean but purposeful, milk-heavy still, eyes bright with the fierce tiredness of a mother who had been given back too much to waste any of it. Then a silver utility truck came around the bend. Astra stopped so suddenly the lead snapped taut in Gideon's hand. Her whole body locked. Not fear this time alone. Recognition sharpened into certainty. She emitted one low, terrible sound from deep in her chest and lunged, not backward, but sideways toward the tree line, pulling hard enough that Gideon had to brace his boots into the snow. The truck passed without slowing, but on its rear quarter panel, just below the mud splatter, Gideon caught sight of a faded black decal. V. R. Transport Astra kept staring long after it vanished. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then Nolan, who had come along behind them from the truck, said quietly, "That's not coincidence anymore." The lead that opened came not from bravery, but from ordinary people who had spent too long talking around their own discomfort. Martha called in old favors, not grand ones, a retired lineman, a widow who once bred spaniels, a boy from the feed store who had loaded sacks into the back of too many anonymous trucks. Nolan followed the proper channels, but quietly, asking for transport registrations and zoning records. Gideon drove where he was asked to drive, listened when told to listen, and learned that evil in small communities often survived because everyone had seen one corner of it and assumed someone else held the whole map. One of the first useful witnesses turned out to be a girl named Tessa Bell. She worked evenings at the gas station near Route 9 and looked younger than 19, though hardship had sharpened the edges of her face. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, with pale freckled skin, a thick braid of copper hair, and wary green eyes that missed little. Tessa spoke in the careful clipped rhythm of someone raised around men whose tempers had made listening safer than talking. When Nolan asked if she had noticed anything unusual the night of the blizzard, she looked first at the floor, then at Gideon, and then finally said she had seen a dark shepherd stagger out from behind a silver transport truck while the driver was inside arguing about fuel. "Did you see the driver?" Nolan asked. Tessa nodded. "Not his whole face, but I saw the coat. And the logo. Same one you showed me." Her fingers tightened on the coffee pot she was holding. The dog looked like it had already decided if nobody helped, it was just going to die standing up. That image stayed with Gideon all the way home. So did the retaliation. It came that same night, not with fire, not with gunshots. Nothing dramatic enough for a movie or siren. Just a hard, ugly crack against the front window just after midnight. Gideon was on his feet before the second stone hit. The glass did not shatter fully, but starred white in the lower corner. By the time he reached the porch, the road below was empty. In the dark beside the shed, the woodpile had been kicked half apart, logs scattered into the snow like broken ribs. Astra stood inside the doorway behind him, not crossing the threshold, body between the room and the puppy box. Nolan came up before dawn to photograph the damage. When he saw the slashed rear tire on Gideon's truck, his face hardened in a way Gideon had not seen before. "This isn't a property disagreement," Nolan said. "No," Gideon answered. "It never was." By the next afternoon, Martha had found something older than fear and more useful than rumor. She arrived with a dusty banker's box pulled from the back room of the shuttered weekly newspaper office. Inside were half-labeled envelopes, old county business advertisements, clippings, photos no one had bothered digitizing, and a single spiral-bound ledger copied years ago by a source who had since died. Most of it was noise. One page was not. Martha spread the photocopy on Gideon's table. Columns, dates, breed codes, payment initials, chip numbers. Eliza, who had come by to check the puppies, bent over it first. "These chip numbers," she said slowly, tapping one line. "2 digits here don't match current manufacturer sequence." Nolan looked up. "Meaning?" "Meaning either the copies are bad," Eliza said, "or someone altered identifiers to make one dog look like another." Martha's eyes flashed. "Meaning our polished saint launders blood through paperwork." The weakest puppy chose that exact moment to cry. Not its usual thin, hungry sound. This one was wrong, high, strained, fading between breaths. Gideon crossed the room instantly. The small, dark-faced pup lay apart from the others, sides fluttering too fast, mouth open, tiny body failing to hold its own heat. Eliza was beside him in seconds. "Bring the warming towels," she said. Gideon obeyed, but his eyes flicked once back toward the ledger still open on the table, toward the chip numbers, the copied dates, the narrow black handwriting of a system finally beginning to reveal itself. Then he looked down at the failing creature in Eliza's hands and understood the shape of the trial before him. Justice was not one road, it was two. One led outward, toward records, witnesses, lies, and the clean face of cruelty protected by money. The other led inward, toward a tiny living body struggling for breath in his own cabin. He could not walk only one, and he could not afford to fail either. By the next morning, the weakest puppy was still alive. That fact alone felt fragile enough to break if anyone spoke too loudly around it. Dr. Eliza Boone had remained at the cabin through most of the night, sleeves rolled, hair half loosened from its usual low knot, eyes sharpened by fatigue and concentration. The little dark-faced pup had turned cold and breathless so quickly that even Gideon, who had spent his life learning how fast a living thing could slip toward the edge, had felt the old helplessness open under his ribs like ice cracking on a river. Eliza warmed the pup against carefully heated cloth, checked the airway, measured drops of formula, and worked with the patience of a woman who understood that panic was often just wasted motion wearing louder shoes. By dawn, the tiny body had steadied. Not strong, not safe, but steady. Astra had watched everything. She had not interfered. She had not cried out. She had simply lain on her blanket, chest rising and falling, eyes fixed on Eliza's hands with a kind of terrible concentration, as if she were memorizing each movement in case the world demanded later that she explain why she had trusted these humans with what she loved most. When the pup was finally returned to her side, Astra bent her head and touched its back with her nose, once gently, then closed her eyes for a moment that looked almost like prayer. Gideon stood at the stove, one hand braced on the edge of the counter, and felt something in him loosen and harden at the same time. He had spent too many years thinking survival belonged only to force. Now, standing in a small cabin that smelled of cedar smoke, antiseptic, and warm milk, he was beginning to understand that survival often belonged to those who refused to leave. By mid-morning, Nolan Pike called. "There's a hearing," he said without preamble. "Emergency temporary custody review. County office wants it handled fast because the paperwork conflict is getting tangled with animal welfare." Gideon stared through the front window at the white valley below. Today? This afternoon? He glanced toward Astra and the puppies. And the search? There was a pause on the line. The county task unit moved early, quietly, based on the chip discrepancy, the witness statements, and Eliza's documentation. They're hitting Voss Ridge before the hearing starts. Gideon's grip tightened around the phone. Do they have enough? They have enough to look, Nolan said. What they find is going to matter. After they hung up, Gideon remained still for several seconds. He did not like courts. He did not like offices where men lied in polished language and called it procedure. He preferred problems with edges he could see. Weather, wounds, engines, firewood, pain. But there are battles, he knew, that cannot be won by skill of hand, only by standing in a room and refusing to step back. He turned toward the nest by the stove. Astra lifted her head at once. She was stronger than she had been even 2 days ago, though still too thin, still marked at the neck, still carrying that quiet alertness in every line of her body. Her black and tan coat had begun to regain its richness, but the scars had not gone anywhere. One ear remained torn. Her amber brown eyes remained too old for comfort. The puppies lay pressed into her warmth, the pale starred one, restless even in sleep, the floppy-eared one, twitching through tiny dreams, and the smallest, dark-faced pup, whose breath Gideon now measured almost unconsciously each time he crossed the room. "You may have to come with me," he said softly. Astra's ears shifted at his voice, not understanding the words perhaps, but understanding tone, intent. Wait. Martha Quinn arrived just before noon, wearing a navy coat over her olive sweater and an expression that suggested she had already argued with at least 2 people before coming up the ridge. Her silver hair had escaped its pins in soft, irritated wisps around her forehead, and her cheeks were bright with cold. "I brought sandwiches," she announced, setting a paper sack on the table. "And irritation." "You always bring irritation," Gideon said. "Yes, but this is premium quality?" She eyed him once, then softened in that sharp old way of hers that never became sentimental. "You look like you're heading to a funeral." "I'm heading to government." "That's the same outfit with worse coffee." Eliza almost smiled. They spent the next hour preparing the way people do when the thing ahead feels larger than the room they stand in. Eliza arranged the veterinary records again. Martha selected copies of the ledger pages, witness notes, and the photograph Nolan had taken of the rusted tag reading Voss Ridge Kennels. Gideon changed nothing about his clothes. He remained in the same fitted green camouflage shirt and matching pants, boots polished only by use, silver threaded cleanly through the undercut at his temples, face bare and stern as winter wood. He looked like what he was, not a man performing respectability, but one who had survived enough to stop needing to. Just before they left, while Gideon was fastening Astra's lead and setting up a padded crate for the puppies in the back of the truck, the smallest pup did something strange. Instead of burrowing toward warmth like it always did, it lifted its tiny dark face, blinking blindly, and made its way, clumsy, wavering, determined, toward the open cabin door where a strip of hard winter light cut across the floor. It stopped there at the edge of the brightness, no bigger than a folded glove, and let out one soft sound. Not distress, not hunger. Something about it made every adult in the room pause. Astra rose at once and crossed to the pup, not panicked, not hurried. She lowered her head, touched it, and guided it back with a care so precise it seemed ceremonial. The puppy went willingly, settling once more against her belly. No one said anything for a moment. Then Martha, very quietly, murmured, "Some creatures are born already reaching." The remark hung in the room like a bell note, and though no one could have explained why, the silence after it felt steadier than the one before. The county hearing office stood in a squat brick building attached to the courthouse annex in the next town over. It was the kind of place built for process rather than beauty, with salt-streaked steps, fluorescent halls, and chairs designed to discourage human hope from becoming too comfortable. Yet on that winter afternoon, it held more life than Gideon expected. Word had spread, not publicly in the grand sense, but in the way small communities pass truth beneath the skin before they ever admit it aloud. By the time Gideon entered with Astra on a short lead and Eliza and Martha beside him, there were already people waiting in the hall. June Alder in her brown winter coat, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Tessa Bell from the gas station, braid over one shoulder, green eyes tense but steady. Two farmers Gideon knew by face, a churchwoman who had once defended Cyrus's generosity, now looking as if generosity had become harder to define. Cyrus Voss was there too. He stood near the far wall with his attorney, smooth and composed in a dark tailored coat, black gloves in one hand, pale face unreadable. Beside him, the attorney looked exactly like the kind of man billed by the hour to turn conscience into delay. Gregory Shaw was in his 50s, trim, silver-haired, and narrow through the shoulders, with a hawkish nose and careful eyes that had probably never once expressed surprise in a courtroom. He wore a charcoal suit, a blue tie, and the expression of a man who considered sincerity a procedural inconvenience. Astra saw Cyrus before Gideon felt the lead tighten. Her entire body changed, not outwardly violent. That would have been easier. Instead, she went rigid in a way that made all her strength visible at once. Her ears flattened, her breathing shortened. She angled her body away from him while trying to keep herself between his line of sight and the crate in Gideon's truck behind the building, as though the puppies were somehow present even here. Fear moved through her, yes, but shaped by memory into something sharper than fear alone. Several people in the hall noticed. Gregory Shaw's gaze flicked down and then away. Nolan Pike emerged from the hearing room at that exact moment, carrying a folder thick enough to look hopeful. He had traded his outdoor coat for a clean Sheriff's Department uniform jacket, the brown fabric fitting neatly across his lean frame. His face looked more tired than usual, but something in it had settled. The hesitation Gideon had seen in him weeks ago was gone. "They're ready," Nolan said. The room itself was plain, wood veneer, county seal on the wall, a judge's bench too low to be grand and too high to be friendly. Administrative hearings were meant to look simple. Gideon had learned long ago that simple-looking places could still change the shape of a life. Hearing Officer Lenora Graves presided from the front. She was a black woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair, warm brown skin, and the controlled stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people weaponize words. Her face was broad and strong, her voice calm without softness. She had the kind of authority that did not rise in volume because it did not need help being heard. Gregory Shaw opened first, all polished concern. He described Gideon as a private citizen who had overstepped. He described Astra as a valuable registered breeding dog removed from lawful ownership during a weather event. He spoke of property, emotional misunderstanding, and procedural caution. By the time he sat down, the air in the room felt thinner. Then Eliza testified. She did not dramatize. That was her power. She stood in her cream veterinary coat with her notes in hand and described Astra's condition exactly as she had observed it. Advanced malnutrition during late pregnancy, untreated respiratory illness, confinement-related injuries, dehydration, and an extreme stress response specific to Cyrus Voss's presence. She described the puppy's low birth weight, the emergency care, the risks associated with maternal depletion. Gregory Shaw tried to suggest those signs might result from a storm escape alone. Eliza looked at him with professional patience. "No," she said, "not these patterns, not these chronic markers." Martha followed, bringing history with her like a blade wrapped in newspaper. She outlined the rumors she had tracked for years: buyers receiving weak puppies, nighttime transport runs, sealed complaints that disappeared. She introduced the copied ledger pages. She did not oversell them. She let the patterns speak where certainty had not yet matured. Then Nolan stood. For a moment the room seemed to lean toward him. He described the physical evidence recovered so far, the witness statements, the intimidation at Gideon's cabin, and the ongoing county search at Voss Ridge. He did not embellish. He did something more dangerous. He confirmed. Gregory Shaw objected when Nolan mentioned the search, but Lenora Graves only lifted one hand. "If the county has active findings relevant to welfare and ownership, I'm hearing them." The door at the side of the room opened 2 minutes later. A county investigator stepped in with a sealed packet. Her name was Marisol Trent, and she looked like a woman who had long ago made peace with other people, disliking what her job uncovered. Mid-40s, dark hair cut blunt at the chin, tan skin, sturdy build, thick winter suit still dusted with snow at the shoulders. Her face was plain except for the eyes, dark, alert, and unsparing. She handed Nolan the packet first. His eyes moved quickly over the first page. Then he looked up. "Your Honor," he said, voice rougher than before, "County Animal Enforcement and Sheriff's deputies executed the warrant at Voss Ridge this morning." Silence. Multiple undocumented dogs recovered. Unheated secondary kennel structure. Damaged crate systems. Incomplete and inconsistent vaccination records. Evidence of microchip alteration and duplicate registration numbers. Additional materials are being processed. Cyrus Voss did not move, but the attorney beside him did, only slightly, a tightening in the mouth, a calculation forced to recalculate. The hearing changed right there, not loudly, no gasps, no theatrical collapse, just a visible shift from dispute to exposure. At last, Lenora Graves turned to Gideon. "Mr. Vale," she said, "you've heard the allegations from both sides. Why did you involve yourself beyond immediate rescue?" Gideon stood. He hated public speaking, hated every eye in the room, hated the way memory tried to crowd him whenever life and judgment stood too close together. For a second, he saw not the hearing room, but another white-lit place, another late arrival, another loss he had never managed to forgive in himself. Then he looked at Astra. She was watching him from beside the bench, body still tense, eyes deep and unwavering. He answered simply. "Because some living things can't protect themselves," he said. "And if the rest of us see that and walk away, the cold outside isn't the worst thing in the room anymore." No one interrupted. Even Gregory Shaw was smart enough to leave silence where it had landed. Lenora Graves wrote for a long moment. Then she gave the ruling. Pending expanded criminal and animal welfare investigation, temporary custody of Astra and her puppies would remain with Gideon Vale. Cyrus Voss was prohibited from attempting removal or contact outside official process. County authorities would continue evidence review. It was not victory. Not yet. But it was the first legal wall raised between cruelty and the vulnerable. When they stepped back into the winter light, Gideon felt the cold hit his face and realized something had changed inside him too. He had spent years living at the edge of Pine Hollow, helping where needed, never fully stepping back into the circle of other people. Now, standing on the courthouse steps with Martha beside him, Eliza behind him, Nolan off to one side fielding another call from the county, and Astra leaning her weight for one brief second against his leg, he understood that silence had a cost. And so did speaking. He was finally willing to pay the better one. Spring did not arrive in Pine Hollow like a parade. It arrived the way mercy often does, quietly, almost shy at first, in signs small enough to be missed by anyone who had forgotten how to look. Water began to drip from the edge of roofs in the late afternoon sun. The black road showed through in crooked ribbons where the plows had finally won. Snowbanks shrank, not all at once, but by patient surrender. The pines held a softer green beneath their frost. Mud reappeared in the driveways, like proof that the earth had not given up under the weight of winter after all. From the porch of Gideon Vale's cabin, the valley looked less like something buried and more like something waking. He stood there one morning with a mug of coffee warming his hand, watching mist rise off the low ditch beyond the fence. At 55, he still looked like a man carved for endurance. Broad shoulders, strong jaw, clean-shaven face, silver threaded neatly into the undercut at his temples, blue-gray eyes deep and steady beneath the morning light. He wore his familiar fitted green camouflage shirt and matching pants, the same clothes he'd been wearing through storms, hospital halls, hearings, and long nights at the stove. Yet even in the sameness of his appearance, something in him had changed. He no longer stood in the doorway like a man guarding the edges of his life. He stood there like a man who belonged to it again. Behind him, the cabin carried the kind of sound it had once not known how to make. The soft scamper of unsteady paws, the scrape of a food bowl nudged too eagerly, the faint, restless whine of puppies who had discovered that hunger, curiosity, and mischief were all cousins. Warmth no longer had to be manufactured there by fire alone. It moved in living bodies now. Astra lay stretched in a patch of sunlight near the threshold. The German shepherd had changed as winter loosened. Her black and tan coat had filled in with health, dark along the back, rich gold through the chest and legs, though the scar at her neck still remained if one looked for it. The old tear in one ear had not healed pretty, but it had healed honest. She was no longer thin in the desperate way she had once been. The ribs no longer pressed like an accusation beneath her skin. Her amber-brown eyes, once clouded by pain and vigilance, now held something calmer. Watchfulness still, because some things once learned never leave entirely, but no longer the constant expectation of harm. Most telling of all, she no longer flinched every time a vehicle passed below the ridge. Sometimes she lifted her head and listened. Sometimes not even that. The three puppies had become themselves. The one with the pale star on its chest was the boldest, forever pushing ahead as if every corner of the world had personally invited him to inspect it. Gideon had named him North because he always seemed to lean toward direction even before he understood where he was going. The floppy-eared one had become Echo, half because of the ear, half because he responded to every sound in the room as if he were born to answer whatever called. The smallest dark-faced pup, the one who had twice nearly slipped beyond reach and yet somehow persisted, had become Slate, for the quiet seriousness in him, the sense that something steady and durable had been written beneath all that early fragility. Together, they turned the cabin into a place where silence could no longer become a habit. Justice took longer. That, too, was part of spring. The county investigation widened after the hearing. What had begun as suspicion hardened slowly into fact. Cyrus Voss was not arrested in a cinematic rush. No screaming deputies, no dramatic confession beneath hard lights. Real corruption rarely ended with the kind of performance it preferred at the beginning. Instead, it unraveled by paper, testimony, and the tedious courage of people willing to keep saying the same unwelcome truth until it could no longer be filed away. Charges came in layers: animal cruelty, illegal confinement, fraudulent registration practices, chip tampering, document falsification. Eventually, counts tied to unlawful breeding operations across county lines. The clean face of his reputation held for a while, then cracked. One witness led to another. Buyers who had once stayed quiet out of embarrassment or fear began talking. Farm workers described hidden pens. A former driver admitted transport logs had been altered. The silence around Voss Ridge, which had once felt like weather, permanent, impersonal, untouchable, proved instead to have been built by human choice. And once enough people chose differently, it began to collapse. The rescued animals were brought out in waves. Some were shepherds, hollow-flanked and stiff with distrust. Others were mixed-breed dogs, kept in conditions no creature should have survived. One old female hound arrived at the county shelter so frightened she could not bear to stand in open space. A young shepherd mix with a white paw refused food unless someone sat beside him. Another dog, a brindled male with one blind eye, startled at the sound of keys jangling and had to be coaxed with broth and patience. Dr. Eliza Boone saw many of them first. She moved between clinic, shelter, and county holding spaces with the same relentless steadiness she had shown on the night Astra's labor broke open the world. Eliza still wore her cream veterinary coat over sensible clothes, still spoke with that plain precision that made truth easier to bear because it arrived without ornament. But Pine Hollow looked at her differently now. Less as a town vet, more as one of the people who had helped drag daylight into a place built to hide things. Deputy Nolan Pike changed too. He had always been a decent man beneath his caution, but caution in small towns can become its own kind of prison. By spring, something in him had unlatched. He still spoke carefully, still measured the weight of his words, but he no longer trimmed them to fit other people's comfort. The county inquiry had cost him dinners, handshakes, easy nods from men who preferred peace without justice. He lost a few things. He gained his own reflection back. Gideon noticed the difference the first time Nolan came to the cabin after the formal custody decision, removed his hat at the door, and smiled without apology. "It's done," he said simply. The adoption papers lay in a large envelope on the table. Gideon looked at them for a long time before touching them. Official county seals, signatures, language that reduced miracle to legal finality. Astra and her 3 pups were his now, as fully as law could say one living soul belonged with another. He signed slowly. Martha Quinn insisted on being present for that moment. She stood by the window with her reading glasses low on her nose, pretending to examine an article draft while very obviously examining Gideon instead. Martha had returned to writing in the aftermath of everything, not newspaper exposés this time, but essays, letters, columns for the regional paper and church bulletin and town archive, all of them somehow about animals, mercy, weather, stubborn people, and what small communities became when they finally chose not to look away. She wrote like a woman who had spent most of her life identifying rot and had now decided that documenting goodness required just as much rigor. When Gideon finished signing, Martha sniffed and said, "There, you've gone and acquired a family." He looked up. "Seems they acquired me first." "Usually the truer version," she said. That evening, after the papers were filed and the house had quieted, Gideon stepped outside alone just before sunset. The snow was nearly gone near the porch, leaving damp patches of grass and dark earth exposed like old scars under melting ice. The air held that rare balance between cold and softness that only comes a few times in early spring. He stood at the fence line with his hands in his pockets and looked toward the road where winter had first brought Astra into his life. Then he heard it. Not from the road, from behind him. Astra had come out without his noticing. She crossed the wet yard slowly, no urgency in her body now, no panic, no guarding. She stopped beside him and, after a pause so gentle it nearly broke him, leaned her full weight once against his leg. Not out of fear, not because she needed holding, but because she chose, in that quiet hour between one season and the next, to stand there with him. For a moment Gideon could not breathe properly. There are gestures so small they almost seem beneath language. And yet they say the one thing grief has always doubted. Stay, you are not alone in this. When he looked down, Astra's eyes met his briefly, calm and unreadable as weather. Then she stepped back and returned to the porch, where the puppies were tumbling over each other in the last gold light. The moment was gone almost at once. But it left behind a stillness warmer than fire. The town did something unexpected after that. Instead of letting the story settle into memory and drift away, Pine Hollow changed because of it. June Alder put a jar on the bakery counter labeled Winter Animal Fund, and to everyone's surprise it filled quickly. Single-dollar bills, crumpled fives, checks from retirees, quiet cash from men who would never have admitted sentiment but knew exactly what cold could do. The old machine shed behind Gideon's property was cleaned, repaired, and insulated with volunteer labor. Nolan brought county forms. Eliza helped establish a basic rescue protocol for storm cases. Martha bullied half the town into donating blankets, feed, and crates. By the time the first real spring rain came, the place had become a small, proper sheltering space for animals caught in weather or neglect before transport could be arranged. Not much. Enough. That was how most good things began in Pine Hollow now. Enough. Gideon did not call himself anything grand, not founder, not rescuer, certainly not hero. He split wood, fixed the shed doors, replaced rusted latches, and kept the place running in the same way he had always kept things running, quietly, consistently, without advertisement. But somewhere along the way, the work stopped feeling like repayment for old failure. It began to feel like life. That was the deepest change of all. For years, Gideon had lived as though every act of kindness had to balance a ledger no one else could see, a private account of lateness, loss, and the woman and child he had not been able to save. Astra had entered his life first as emergency, then as responsibility, then as evidence, then as cause. But in the end, she had become something stranger and gentler, not a debt to be paid, but a bond freely given. He no longer rose each day asking how much of the past he could outrun. He rose asking what needed tending now. On the clearest morning of early spring, he stood once more at the cabin door with a mug of coffee in his hand. Snow still clung in dirty patches along the fence posts, but the yard had begun to green in places. Astra lay stretched on the porch boards, eyes half closed in the sun, one ear turning now and then toward the puppies. North charged clumsily across the wet grass and collided with a flower pot. Echo barked at his own reflection in a puddle. Slate, smaller and darker, stood for a long moment studying a drifting feather before batting it with solemn curiosity. Gideon watched them and smiled. Not the guarded half-smile he sometimes gave June's bad jokes. Not the brief, dry twist of amusement he wore when Martha sharpened herself at someone's expense. A real smile, quiet, unforced, almost startled by its own existence. The cabin behind him was still the same place he had built with lonely hands. The porch was the same, the ridge road, the pines. The valley, but it was no longer merely a place to survive winter. It had become a home. And standing there, with morning light on the wet earth, Astra at peace, 3 ridiculous puppies stumbling across the first grass of the year, Gideon understood at last what Mercy had been trying to teach him all along. The world is not saved by strength alone, not by force, not by fury, not even by endurance. Sometimes the thing that leads us through the harshest cold is simply the refusal to turn away when something wounded looks up and asks, without words, to live. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. It does not arrive with thunder, fire, or a sky split open. Sometimes the miracle comes quietly, wrapped in pain, fear, and exhaustion. Sometimes it comes as a wounded mother dog in the snow, a man who chooses not to look away, and a small act of mercy that slowly becomes a new life. This story reminds us that love does not always begin with comfort. Sometimes it begins with responsibility. Sometimes God places something fragile in our path, not to burden us, but to awaken the part of our heart that has been sleeping under grief, routine, or disappointment. Gideon thought he was rescuing Astra and her puppies, but in truth, God was also rescuing him. Through their need, he gave Gideon back a reason to open his heart, trust again, and belong again. That is how grace often works in everyday life. It may not look dramatic. It may look like checking on a neighbor, helping someone when it is inconvenient, feeding a hungry animal, speaking up when the truth is uncomfortable, or staying kind in a world that keeps teaching people to turn cold. We often wait for big signs from heaven, but many times God sends His mercy through simple chances to love, protect, and remain faithful. The lesson of this story is clear. Never underestimate what can happen when one person refuses to walk past suffering. A small act of compassion can break the power of fear, uncover hidden evil, heal an old wound, and create a home where there was once only loneliness. That is not weakness. That is holy strength. So if this story touched your heart, let it stay with you in your daily life. Be the person who stops. Be the person who notices. Be the person who helps, even when no one is clapping, even when it costs something. Because sometimes the life you save will also save something inside you. If this message meant something to you, please share this story with someone who still believes in kindness, leave a comment, and tell us what moment touched your heart the most, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of loyalty, hope, healing, and quiet miracles. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, heal what is hurting inside you, and send the right help at the right time. May He watch over the people and animals you love, and may His peace stay with you through every storm and every season ahead.